when you start thinking about podcasts as a content format, you got to think about it kind of from two perspectives, right? Are you in both aspects, you're building this thing as sort of a media company, right?
Right.
But what's the end objective of your podcast, right? In some cases, you just want to build a podcast that is getting as many possible listeners as possible so you can run advertising against it to monetize the podcast, right? And obviously that's what a lot of the YouTube celebrities and like folks like Joe Rogan and all those kind of people are doing is they're just putting content out there to make money on, pre-roll, mid-roll, ads, right? And they're monetizing their content, and they're making a pretty good living doing it,
Yeah,
right?
it's
We live
essentially
in
a
LA.
radio show at that point, right?
Yep, exactly. And so that's one aspect of a way to look at a podcast. And, I actually don't know the folks who are listening to this. You might be one of those people who want to start a podcast to grow an audience and to monetize that channel through AdSense, right? On the flip side, there's what I would call more business or educational focused podcasts or branded podcasts, right? And the purpose of those isn't necessarily to monetize the channel, right, and drive revenue from the channel. The purpose of those is to help with lead generation and customer acquisition, right? So I think today we'll talk about kind of those two examples, right? You can definitely build a YouTube channel that will monetize itself, and you can drive ad revenue off of it. But you can also build a branded podcast or a branded YouTube channel that will help you with top of funnel traffic, which will ultimately result in lead acquisition and customer acquisition, right? So, I do think that is, two important aspects to think of. And,
Yep.
Maybe Jared, like you can talk about like a podcast that might fit into like one or both of those categories.
Yeah, so I think just to kind of touch and piggyback on what you're just saying, I think that, and we talked about this in a couple episodes. I can't remember which one it is now, but we talked a couple episodes back. Scroll back and listen to all of them. That if you're using this the way that we're kind of showing the intention of using it, it's more about building this like ecosystem. So these become additional channels to what you've already built out. And this just becomes another prong in your ecosystem that you're building out, which is what you're more leading to, not the AdSense, not the like Joe Rogan style of podcasting. And a couple that I would say that are really good at doing this is both you and I have listened to the Drift podcast. And that's a podcast for marketing. And they actually have a network of different podcasts. So similar to like the model like we're doing where they have a couple different versions of different shows that you can kind of check out. But they're essentially building an ecosystem around that then it's driving it to, their ultimate goal, which is, conversational messaging, either via chatbot or text. Conversational marketing, I guess, is what it's really ultimately called. But they're building an ecosystem. And I would say that you're starting to see this spill into bigger platforms, like we mentioned on another episode, HBO. All of their new series that they're doing, especially the docu-series, they're adding a complimentary free podcast to it. So you can go and listen to the podcast on the podcasting networks, but if you haven't watched the show, then you don't know what you're missing out and you don't know what they're talking about. So then you're like, oh, I got to go get a subscription to HBO Go and now watch the show so I can kind of have more context. Or if you're coming from the other way, you're really into the show that they're producing and you're like, man, I really want to know more about this. You can go listen to the podcast. So that's more of the sense of building the ecosystem of way of getting more people to go sign up for ultimately more subscriptions. And then like you touched on, which is more of the ad sense. So the Ringer is a great platform that displays this probably the best right now. Them and probably Barstool Media does it really good. But both of these companies focus on building content around sports and culture are the two main pillars that they kind of build all their content around. So they do a lot of crossing over, like where does sports play into culture? Where does culture play into sports? And then they have a ton of different podcasts throughout their entire content. I don't know what to call it, but their website
syndicate. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess it's more of like, I don't know. I call it a network. I guess it's a content network.
Yeah.
for lack of a better term.
Yeah, sure.
But they'll have 30
Yep.
plus different shows, and each one has its own flavor, and all they're doing is basically building audiences around each one of these flavors of podcasts, and then they're able to advertise with large advertising revenue going towards them. So that's the alternative way that you were kind of mentioning. And I guess there's like a third version of podcasting, which is more like the storytelling method. So you'll see things like Serial was like a breakout one a couple of years ago, where they were basically
Yep.
just doing a documentary, but it's very highly produced. It's very thought out. Like it's scripted, so every word you're hearing is read off a script. So there's that style,
Yep.
and obviously that can fall into either bucket, whether you're trying to sell ads or you're trying to just attach more to your ecosystem. That's another way to think about it.